The hum of the engines filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. It was one of those long international flights, the kind where people carried pillows from home and wore comfortable clothes, preparing for hours in the sky. The air was charged with the usual shuffle of luggage, the overhead bins snapping closed, and the muffled announcements echoing through the speakers. Among the travelers that day was a young black mother named Alana, cradling her newborn in her arms. She moved carefully, balancing her baby's fragile weight while trying to navigate the narrow aisle. Alana was calm, her movements graceful, but the exhaustion of caring for an infant was written in her eyes. She had been awake all night, feeding her child, soothing her cries, and ensuring she had everything packed for this journey. As she made her way to her seat, a few fellow passengers smiled warmly, offering to hold her bag or simply giving her space. For a moment, Alana felt the comfort of kindness in strangers, but not everyone saw her humanity. Standing near the front was a flight attendant named Victoria, a woman who carried herself with sharpness, her uniform pressed to perfection, her smile thin and mechanical. To most passengers, she appeared professional, but beneath the veneer of customer service was a disdain she did not bother to mask, especially when it came to people she thought were beneath her. When Alana reached her assigned seat and tried to settle, the baby began to fuss. She gently rocked her child, whispering soothing words, her voice soft and steady. A few nearby passengers offered sympathetic nods. Anyone who had traveled with children understood the challenge. But Victoria's eyes narrowed. She walked briskly down the aisle, her heels clicking like a warning. "Ma'am," she said sharply, her voice carrying a tone more suited for scolding than assisting. "You need to control your baby. People paid for peace on this flight." Alana, already worn from the journey, forced a polite smile. "I'm doing my best. She's just a bit unsettled. I'll calm her." But Victoria did not move on. Instead, she lingered, arms folded, as though waiting for Alana to fail. When the baby let out another cry, Victoria snapped. She leaned down far too close for comfort and hissed, "If you can't manage, you shouldn't be on this flight at all." Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, sensing the hostility. Alana's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She wanted to disappear, to shield her baby not just from the noise of the engines, but from the sting of judgment. Still, she remained composed, whispering, "Please, I'm handling it." Victoria's temper flared. In an instant of cruelty and arrogance, she reached toward Alana as if to grab the baby. Alana instinctively pulled back, but not before the flight attendant's hand struck her across the cheek. The sound was soft yet sharp, a gasp rippling through the cabin. The baby wailed, startled and frightened, while Alana froze in disbelief. Her hand rose to her face, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she could not process what had just happened. A flight attendant, a person meant to ensure safety and care, had assaulted her in front of dozens of witnesses. The cabin fell into silence, the kind that weighs heavy with shock. A man in the next row stood abruptly, his voice firm. "That's out of line. You don't put your hands on a mother." Others murmured their agreement, some pulling out phones, ready to capture what was unfolding. But Victoria, blinded by her sense of superiority, brushed them off. "Mind your business. She needs to learn how to behave." Her words dripped with disdain, as if Alana's very presence on the plane was offensive to her. Alana trembled, but not with fear, with a rising storm of anger and humiliation. She had endured many subtle forms of discrimination in her life, but never had she been so openly disrespected, so physically violated. She thought of her baby, of the world her daughter would grow up in, and a tear slid down her cheek, not from weakness, but from the weight of carrying dignity in the face of cruelty. At that very moment, a tall man rose from first class. His suit was impeccable, his presence commanding. He had been watching, waiting, his jaw tight with controlled rage. Every eye turned to him as he walked steadily toward the chaos. His gaze never left Alana, his wife, still clutching their child. It was Derek, her husband. And though the flight attendant didn't yet realize it, he was not just another passenger. Derek was the owner of the airline. The very planes that carried the company's name, the salaries of every attendant and pilot, Victoria's included, were made possible by his vision, his leadership, and his success. When he reached Alana, he gently touched her shoulder, his voice low and tender. "Are you okay?" Her eyes met his, and the sight of him, her partner, her protector, steadied her trembling heart. She nodded faintly, though the pain in her eyes spoke volumes. He looked down at his daughter, still crying, and then back at the red mark on his wife's cheek. His expression hardened. Turning slowly, Derek faced Victoria. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, the silence stretching. "Did you just put your hands on my wife?" His voice was calm, but beneath the calm was steel. Victoria faltered, her confidence wavering for the first time. She glanced at the other passengers, at the phones recording her every move, and tried to regain her composure. "Sir, I was only trying to—" "To what?" Derek cut her off, his tone rising. "To humiliate her. To strike her. To show the world that you think her life, her dignity, and her child don't matter." His words hung heavy in the air, carrying not only the pain of the moment, but the echoes of generations who had been silenced, demeaned, and told to accept injustice quietly. Alana sat clutching her baby, tears streaming down her face as passengers nodded in agreement. Victoria swallowed hard, but her pride wouldn't let her apologize. Instead, she muttered, "She was disturbing the flight. I did what I had to." A collective gasp broke through the crowd. A woman seated nearby shouted, "You assaulted her!" "That's what you did," another added. "This isn't how you treat anyone, let alone a mother with a child." Derek stepped closer, his height casting a shadow over the trembling attendant. His voice dropped, low and deliberate, each word sharp as a blade. "Do you know who I am?" Victoria shook her head, her eyes darting nervously. "I own this airline," Derek said, his tone steady but fierce. "Every uniform, every plane, every paycheck comes from the company I built." "And you thought it was acceptable to put your hands on a passenger, on my wife?" "The mother of my child." The realization hit Victoria like a thunderclap. Her face drained of color. The authority she had wielded so carelessly crumbled instantly, leaving only fear and regret in its place. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The cabin erupted in murmurs, passengers exchanging looks of astonishment. Some applauded quietly. Others whispered prayers of thanks that justice had walked down that aisle. Alana, still shaken, held her baby tighter. She felt the warmth of her husband's presence beside her and the weight of the moment sinking in. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about dignity, respect, and the power of standing against cruelty. Derek turned back to his wife, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You don't deserve this," he whispered. "No one does." But the flight wasn't over, and the story was only beginning. What Derek would decide to do next would send a message, not only to Victoria, but to every person who believed they could strip dignity away from others without consequence. The cabin buzzed with energy, the passengers united by shock, anger, and the raw anticipation of what would come next. For too long, scenes like this had unfolded in silence, moments where dignity was stolen and pain was brushed aside as though it were trivial. But this moment would not be hidden. Dozens of phones recorded, and dozens of eyes bore witness to a reckoning that had been centuries in the making. Derek's stare never left Victoria, whose uniform no longer gave her authority, but exposed her for what she had done. His words had stripped away her arrogance, leaving her small, trembling under the weight of her own actions. But Derek was not done, not yet. He motioned toward another attendant, a younger man who had been standing nearby, frozen in disbelief. "Bring me the captain," Derek ordered. His tone was calm, but layered with a quiet force that allowed no refusal. The attendant hesitated only for a moment before nodding quickly and hurrying down the aisle. Alana sat silently, her baby's cries slowly subsiding into small hiccups against her chest. She stroked her daughter's back, whispering words of comfort, though her own spirit still shook from the slap. Her hand brushed the lingering sting on her cheek. She wanted to be strong for her child, but a question gnawed at her. What if Derek hadn't been here? How many other mothers, fathers, and children had endured such indignities with no one to stand for them? The thought broke her heart. Within minutes, the captain appeared, his hat tucked under one arm, confusion written across his face. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice carrying authority but also concern. Derek turned to him, his voice measured. "Your employee assaulted my wife, in front of the passengers, in front of my child, and I want you to understand who you have working on this flight." The captain's eyes widened. He looked at Alana, at the faint red mark on her cheek, then at the passengers, who all nodded and whispered their agreement. Several held their phones high, ready to share the truth with the world. The captain's expression hardened as he turned to Victoria. "Is this true?" Victoria stammered, her voice breaking. I didn't mean she was disrupting. You thought you could lay hands on her." Derek's voice cut through her excuses. You thought her dignity was optional? That my wife could be treated as less than human? The captain's jaw tightened. This is unacceptable. Miss, step aside. But Derek raised a hand, stopping him. Not yet. She needs to hear this. They all do. His gaze swept the cabin, meeting the eyes of every passenger. This isn't just about one slap. This isn't just about my wife or my family. This is about how often people like us, black men, black women, black children, are treated as if our presence is a burden, our pain invisible, our humanity negotiable. The words rang out heavy with truth. Passengers leaned forward, some nodding, some with tears welling in their eyes. A middle-aged woman whispered, Amen, under her breath. My wife carried our daughter into this plane with love in her arms. Derek continued, his voice trembling with emotion now. She asked for nothing but respect. Instead, she was humiliated and assaulted. And why? Because someone in a uniform decided that her being here, with her crying baby, wasn't good enough. This violence, this arrogance, it's the same story my people have carried for generations. His voice rose, filled with fire and grief. But let me make something clear. That story ends today, at least on this airline. Because I built this company to serve people, all people, with dignity. I built it so that every passenger could feel safe, respected, and seen. And I will not allow anyone, not even in my own house, to tear that down. The cabin erupted in applause, loud and defiant, as though every clap was a strike against centuries of injustice. Some passengers stood clapping until their hands stung, their faces lit with the hope that they were witnessing more than an incident. They were witnessing change. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, her once cold demeanor shattered. She opened her mouth, searching for words, but they fell flat. I didn't know. You didn't need to know, Derek said firmly. You shouldn't have to know who someone's husband is, or what title they carry, to treat them with respect. You shouldn't have to know that the man standing before you owns the very uniform on your back to decide not to strike a woman holding her child. Humanity should be enough. Her worth should be enough. Alana's tears flowed freely now, not of pain but of release. Her husband's words lifted her burden, transformed her humiliation into strength. She looked down at her daughter, her tiny chest rising and falling against her, and thought, you will grow up in a world where your mother's dignity was defended. The captain stepped forward, his voice resolute. Sir, I assure you, she will never serve on one of your flights again. I'll see to it personally. Derek shook his head slowly. No, I'll see to it. Effective immediately, she's done. When we land, she will be escorted off this plane and relieved of her duties. And every one of you here, he said, turning back to the passengers, every one of you has witnessed why this matters. Don't let this be another story that fades. Speak it, share it, demand better. Phones continued to record, faces determined. The story was already spreading beyond the walls of the plane. Victoria stood trembling, stripped not only of her job, but of the illusion that cruelty comes without consequence. For the first time, she saw the power of the people she had tried to belittle, the power of dignity, of unity, of truth spoken out loud. The rest of the flight passed in a hush. Passengers whispered words of encouragement to Alana, some offering her tissues, others telling her how strong she was. A young black girl seated a few rows back stared at her with wide, admiring eyes, as though she had just witnessed a queen defending her throne. Alana smiled softly at her, the kind of smile that carries both pain and pride. When the plane touched down, there was no mistaking the significance of what had happened. Airline officials were already waiting at the gate, alerted by the captain mid-flight. Victoria was led away, her once perfect posture bent under the weight of her disgrace. But Alana walked off with her head held high, her baby safe in her arms, her husband by her side, and the quiet strength of knowing she had endured. In the days that followed, the video spread like wildfire. News outlets replayed Derek's words. Social media overflowed with hashtags demanding justice. And countless mothers, black mothers especially, shared their own stories of indignity while traveling, while working, while simply existing. The world saw not just an incident on a flight, but a truth that could no longer be ignored. For Alana, it was never about revenge. It was about respect. She wanted the world to know that black lives are not inconveniences, that a crying baby is not a crime, that a black mother's dignity cannot be slapped away. And through her pain, through her tears, that message was delivered louder than any microphone could carry. Derek stood beside her through it all, proud not just of the empire he had built, but of the family he cherished above all else. He watched as his wife's story inspired others to speak, to stand, to demand better. And he knew deep in his heart that this was the true legacy he wanted to leave. Not wealth, not airplanes, but dignity, justice, and love. In the quiet of their home one night, Alana rocked her baby to sleep. The glow of the city lights flickering through the window. Derek wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on her shoulder. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the past days settling between them. Finally, Alana whispered, "Do you think she'll remember this?" "Our daughter?" Derek smiled faintly. "She won't remember the slap. But she'll grow up knowing her mother's worth was defended. She'll grow up knowing her father stood for her mother's dignity. And she'll grow up knowing that no one can take her humanity from her." Alana closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her cheek. But this time it was a tear of peace. She held her daughter tighter, whispering a silent promise, "You will live free, loved, and proud." And somewhere in the world, another black mother saw the story online, wiped her own tears, and whispered back to herself, "So will I." The days after the flight felt like a storm that never stopped. The video, shaky and raw, spread across the internet faster than fire on dry grass. Millions of people watched Alana being slapped. Millions heard Derek's words echo through the cabin. And millions saw the truth, that dignity, even in the air at 30,000 feet, could be stolen in an instant. But this time, dignity was not taken quietly. News anchors replayed the footage in prime time. Commentators debated the incident on talk shows, some demanding accountability, others trying to dismiss it as an overreaction. Yet the images were undeniable. A black mother clutching her crying baby, her cheek burning red with the mark of humiliation, and her husband, the owner of the airline, declaring with fire that respect was not optional. For Alana, it was overwhelming. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from strangers, mothers, fathers, even young people who had been silent victims of discrimination. "You gave me courage," one message read. "I wish someone had stood up for me the way your husband stood up for you." Another wrote, "You don't know me, but you reminded me I'm worthy of respect." Alana cried reading those words. Not from pain, but from the knowledge that her suffering had become a torch for others to see by. Still, she felt the weight of reliving the moment over and over every time she turned on the television. Healing was slow, but every time her daughter smiled, she found strength. Derek, meanwhile, faced the storm head-on. His office became a war room as lawyers, public relations teams, and airline executives scrambled to address the fallout. Some begged him to issue a carefully crafted corporate apology, something that would quiet the noise and protect the company's image. But Derek wasn't interested in saving face. "We're not covering this up," he told the board during a tense meeting. "We're not softening it. We're not burying it under legal jargon. This isn't about protecting profits, it's about protecting people." One executive nervously pushed back, "Sir, if we admit fault too openly, it could lead to lawsuits, settlements, financial losses." Derek slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising. "The financial loss isn't what matters here. The loss is in our humanity if we don't address this. If we let people believe this company tolerates abuse, we've already failed." Silence fell across the boardroom. No one argued further. Within hours, Derek issued a public statement, not through a press release, but standing in front of cameras, speaking directly to the world. Alana stood beside him, their baby in her arms, her head held high despite the ache still lingering inside her. "My wife was assaulted on one of our flights," Derek said firmly. "She was assaulted while holding our child. The employee responsible has been terminated. But this is bigger than one person losing their job. This is about a culture that, too often, sees black women as problems instead of people, as burdens instead of mothers, as less deserving of respect than others." That ends here. On this airline, we will be implementing mandatory training on dignity, bias, and respect, not as a box to check, but as a promise to every passenger. Your humanity matters the moment you step on board. The cameras flashed, journalists shouted questions, but what spread across the internet wasn't just his announcement. It was the sight of Alana, standing with quiet strength, rocking her baby in front of the world, and the fire in Derek's voice that said this wasn't about corporate damage, control, it was about justice. In the weeks that followed, something shifted. Passengers began sharing their own stories of discrimination, some subtle, some blatant. Black travelers, who had once stayed silent about mistreatment, suddenly found their voices. Social media lit up with the hashtag #DignityInTheAir, a movement sparked not by activists or politicians, but by a mother and father who refused to let an injustice be swept under the rug. Airlines around the world began issuing new policies, scrambling not to be the next company caught in a scandal. Flight crews attended workshops on cultural sensitivity, human dignity, and compassion for passengers traveling with children. The world was watching, and change, though small, began to take root. But in the quiet of their home, Alana and Derek knew the work wasn't over. One evening, Alana sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open, reading yet another email from a woman who had faced humiliation while traveling with her children. She sighed, rubbing her temples. There are so many stories, Derek. Too many, I can't even read them all. Derek placed a hand on her shoulder. That's because this is bigger than us. But maybe this is where we start something. A foundation, a program, a way to give people a voice and protect them before they have to go through what you did. Alana looked at him, tired but inspired. You mean, use this pain for something bigger? He nodded. Exactly. We can't change what happened, but we can make sure our daughter grows up in a world where it happens less. And so together, they began the work. Alana, once just a passenger on a plane, became a voice for mothers everywhere. She spoke at universities, at conferences, at gatherings of women who had carried the same silent wounds. She told her story not with bitterness, but with the raw honesty that stirred hearts and opened eyes. Her words echoed, when you slap a mother, you don't just hurt her, you send a message to her child about her worth. And I refused to let my daughter grow up believing her mother's dignity could be taken. People listened. People learned. As for Victoria, the disgraced flight attendant, her name vanished from the airline roster, but her story lived on as a warning. Reports surfaced that she struggled to find work afterward, her reputation marred by the viral video. Some said she grew bitter, others whispered that she sought counseling, trying to confront the prejudice that had once controlled her actions. Whether she found redemption or not, her choices would forever be remembered as the catalyst for a movement she never intended to spark. Years later, Alana would sit with her daughter, now a bright young girl, and tell her the story, not the slap itself, but what came after. She told her of the people who stood up, of the voices that rose in unity, of the changes that rippled through an entire industry, because one mother refused to stay silent. Her daughter listened wide-eyed, then climbed into her mother's lap and whispered, Mama, you're so strong. Alana smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. No, baby. We're strong. And don't you ever forget it. Derek, watching from the doorway, knew that his empire wasn't just measured in airplanes or profits anymore. It was measured in every mother who traveled without fear, every passenger who stepped on board knowing their dignity was protected. What began as a moment of cruelty at 30,000 feet had become a story of justice, love, and change that no slap could silence. And as long as they lived, Alana and Derek carried that truth in their hearts. Dignity is not given by uniforms, titles, or power. It is owned by every human being, and it can never be taken away. Years passed, yet the memory of that day in the airplane cabin never faded. For Alana, it became more than just a personal scar, it became a chapter in history, one told not only by her family, but by countless others who drew courage from it. Her daughter, Maya, grew older, and with each year, her understanding of the world deepened. She was no longer the tiny baby in Alana's arms that day, but a sharp, inquisitive young girl with questions that often carried more weight than her parents expected. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Maya looked up at her mother and asked, Mama, do people still look at you like you don't belong? Alana hesitated, her heart tugging at the innocence behind the question. She reached out and smoothed Maya's curls. Sometimes, yes, but the difference now, baby, is that when they do, I don't let it define me. And I make sure it doesn't define you. Maya tilted her head. Is that why you always speak at those big events? To remind people? Alana smiled softly. Exactly. Because dignity isn't something someone else can give or take. It's something we carry inside. And when people forget that, it's our job to remind them. Derek, listening from across the room, felt pride swell in his chest. The foundation they had started, the dignity project, had grown far beyond what they imagined. It provided resources for mothers traveling with children, created hotlines for passengers to report discrimination, and trained airline employees worldwide. It was no longer about one incident, one airline, or even one family. It had become a movement. But movements are never without resistance. There were those who dismissed the project as too political, those who claimed Alana was exaggerating, and those who argued that one slap didn't warrant such a response. They wrote articles, left comments online, and tried to minimize the pain she had endured. Yet Alana never wavered. At each speaking engagement, she met their dismissal with truth. "It's never just one slap," she would say, her voice unwavering. "It's every slap before it. Every insult, every humiliation carried in silence. It's the weight of centuries pressed onto one moment, and the refusal to let it pass unnoticed." Her words pierced through denial, leaving even her critics with little ground to stand on. Maya, now old enough to attend some of these events, watched her mother with admiration. She saw how her mother's voice carried across auditoriums, how people leaned in, how their eyes filled with tears or lit with determination, and each time she whispered to herself, "That's my mom." But even as their public work grew, the private wounds lingered. Sometimes late at night, Alana would wake from dreams where the slap replayed in slow motion, the sound echoing louder than it had in reality. She would sit up, clutching her chest, until Derek wrapped his arms around her. "You're safe," he would whisper. "You turned pain into power. You didn't just survive, you transformed." Those moments reminded her that healing wasn't linear. Courage didn't erase scars. It simply gave them meaning. Meanwhile, Victoria's life took a different path. After losing her job, she became a symbol, not of power, but of consequence. For years, she carried bitterness, resenting Alana, resenting Derek, resenting the world that had judged her so harshly. But time, as it often does, forced reflection. She took a job far from the airline industry, working quietly, anonymously. In her solitude, she began to read books about history, about race, about dignity. Slowly, painfully, she confronted the prejudice she had once carried like armor. For the first time, she saw herself not as the victim of public shame, but as the perpetrator of harm. One day, nearly a decade later, she wrote a letter. "Dear Alana, I know you may never read this, and if you do, you may never forgive me. But I must try. I was wrong, so wrong to see you as less than human, to treat you with cruelty, to put my hands on you. I thought I was protecting the peace of that flight, but really I was protecting my own prejudice. I have lived with that shame every day since. I don't ask for friendship or even for forgiveness. I only ask that you know, I finally see what I did, and I am sorry." The letter arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. Alana read it quietly, her hands trembling. For a long time, she didn't know what to feel, anger, relief, or sorrow. She showed it to Derek, who read it silently, and then folded it back into her hands. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Alana looked out the window, watching Maya play in the yard. "I want to let it go," she whispered. "Not for her, but for me. Because carrying her hatred any longer only gives it power. And I'm done giving it power." And so she tucked the letter into a drawer, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder that even those who cause harm can change. As years turned into decades, the story of that flight became less about scandal and more about legacy. Universities taught it as a case study in dignity and justice. Airlines cited it as the spark for sweeping changes in customer care. Families told it to their children as proof that one act of courage could ripple across the world. For Maya, it was more than history. It was her inheritance. On the day she graduated from college, she stood at the podium delivering her commencement speech. The auditorium was filled with families, professors, and students, but her eyes found her parents in the crowd. Alana, tears brimming in her eyes, and Derek, standing tall with pride. "My mother once told me," Maya began, "that dignity isn't given by uniforms, titles, or power. It belongs to every human being." I grew up knowing that truth, not because it was written in a book, but because I watched her live it. I watched her stand tall after being humiliated, and I watched my father stand beside her with love and fire. That lesson is my compass, and I promise you I will carry it forward. The audience erupted in applause, but Alana heard only her daughter's voice echoing in her heart. She squeezed Derek's hand, her chest swelling with pride. The pain of that day in the sky had birthed a future she could never have imagined, a future where her daughter walked into the world, carrying not the weight of humiliation, but the crown of dignity. And as the applause roared, Alana closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer of gratitude. For survival, for justice, for legacy, for the truth that no slap, no insult, no prejudice could ever silence the power of dignity. The weeks that followed brought a kind of quiet healing, but also deep reflection. Alana had returned to her routines, caring for Nia, supporting Derek, and staying active in the community. Yet she often found herself pausing in moments of silence, holding her daughter close and whispering affirmations into her tiny ears. You are worthy. You are loved. You will never be less than anyone. It became almost a ritual, a way to heal both her daughter and herself from the shadows of that day on the plane. Derek, too, carried the weight of responsibility. He was no stranger to the demands of leadership. But this situation had cut closer to home than anything before. It had blurred the line between personal and professional, between family and business. He had seen firsthand what discrimination could do, not in abstract statistics or market surveys, but in the raw pain etched into his wife's face. And it had ignited in him a deeper mission, to turn the airline into not just a company that transported people, but one that stood as a beacon for dignity, respect, and equality. The airline's public stance had earned widespread praise, but not everyone supported it. Critics accused Derek of using his position for personal gain, of overreacting, of trying to score points in the cultural debates of the time. Letters and emails poured in, some hateful, others filled with gratitude. Alana shielded herself from the noise, but Derek faced it head-on. For every critic who questioned his motives, there were a dozen voices thanking him for finally addressing issues that had long been ignored. Flight attendants, pilots, ground staff, and passengers alike wrote to say they had experienced or witnessed similar injustices. The incident had unlocked a floodgate of truths long suppressed. Meanwhile, Victoria, the attendant, whose slap had started it, all remained at the center of a storm she had never imagined. Her name, once unknown beyond her circle, now trended in headlines and on social feeds. Some pitied her, others despised her, and a few defended her actions with venomous ignorance. But in the quiet of her own home, she faced herself in a way she never had before. She replayed the moment in her mind countless times, the dismissive tone she'd used, the anger that had flashed, the hand that had struck, and every time the shame grew heavier. She began attending counseling, though she told few people. She knew she had to confront the prejudice that had shaped her, even if it cost her the career she'd once loved. One evening, Derek came home to find Alana sitting on the porch, rocking Nia gently. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of amber and violet, and for a moment the world felt calm. Derek sat beside her, slipping an arm around her shoulder. You know, he said softly, this whole thing, it's more than us now. People are watching, learning, changing. Maybe that's the gift in all this pain. Alana nodded, though her eyes glistened. I just want Nia to grow up in a world where her skin isn't a burden in someone else's eyes, where she's seen for the light she carries, not the color she wears. She kissed the top of her daughter's head, then looked at Derek. Promise me we'll never stop fighting for that. Derek squeezed her hand. I promise. For you, for her, for every person who's been made to feel small when they are anything. But his voice held the weight of conviction, but also the tenderness of a man who loved fiercely and refused to be broken. Months later, the airline hosted a major conference on equity in air travel. Leaders from across the industry gathered, some reluctantly, others eagerly. Derek stood at the podium, Alana in the audience, Nia asleep in her arms. His speech was not fiery, not accusatory, but steady and resolute. He spoke of dignity as a non-negotiable currency, of the responsibility companies held to protect not just the comfort, but the humanity of those they served. And as he spoke, Alana felt something shift in the room, a recognition, a reckoning, a ripple of change that began with them, but would not end there. For their family, life would never return to the simple anonymity it once held. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps their story was meant to carry weight, to challenge, to inspire. Alana still bore the memory of that slap, but she no longer let it define her. Instead, she held on to the strength that had risen from it. The strength to stand tall, to speak out, to love louder. And in that strength, she found healing. Not just for herself, but for all those who saw their reflection in her story. Years passed, but the memory of that single flight never faded. It wasn't spoken of every day, nor did Alana allow it to consume her, but it lived in the back of her mind like a scar, healed over, yet forever marking what once was. But scars are not only signs of pain. They are also evidence of survival. Nia grew into a bright, curious child full of questions and wonder. By the time she was old enough to sit at the dinner table and listen to her parents' conversations, she had already absorbed more than Alana realized. She noticed how people looked at her father with admiration, how her mother carried herself with quiet grace, and how both of them spoke often about justice and dignity. One night when she was about 7, she asked, "Mama, why do people always say you're strong? What happened?" The question landed softly, but it carried the weight of a past that Alana had carefully shielded from her daughter. Derek looked at his wife, giving her the choice. And in that moment, Alana realized it was time. She told Nia the story, not with bitterness, not with anger, but with honesty. She explained what had happened on that plane, how someone's prejudice had boiled over into an act of cruelty, and how it could have broken her. But instead, it became the beginning of something bigger. "Strength, my love," Alana told her gently, brushing her daughter's cheek, "is not about never being hurt. It's about what you do after. It's about rising, even when someone tries to push you down." Nia listened, her little eyes wide. And when her mother finished, she wrapped her arms tightly around her. "I'll be strong too, Mama, just like you." In that embrace, Alana felt something release. The pain of that day no longer belonged only to her. It had been transformed into a lesson, a seed planted in her daughter's heart that would one day bloom into courage of her own. Derek, meanwhile, had continued his work with the airline, pushing for lasting reforms. Years of effort led to concrete change, not only within his own company but across the industry. Diversity in hiring increased. Policies protecting passengers from discrimination were strengthened. Sensitivity training became not just a checkbox exercise, but an ongoing commitment. And when other CEOs questioned his persistence, Derek reminded them of a simple truth. When we protect the dignity of one, we protect the dignity of all. The story of the incident gradually evolved from scandal to legacy. News. Outlets revisited it years later as a turning point for corporate accountability. Universities used it as a case study. Activists pointed to it as proof that, even in the smallest of moments, a single interaction between a mother, her child, and a flight attendant, there is the power to ignite widespread change. As for Victoria, her life had taken a different path. After losing her position, she disappeared from the public eye. But the weight of her actions stayed with her. Years later, she reached out with a handwritten letter, delivered to Derek's office. In it, she confessed her shame, acknowledged her wrongdoing, and expressed a desire to live differently. "I cannot undo what I did," she wrote, "but I hope, in my remaining years, to live in a way that honors the humanity I once denied." Alana read the letter quietly, then tucked it away. She did not respond, but she carried a quiet peace in knowing that even those who harm can choose to change. In the end, the incident became more than a painful memory. It became a story passed down, not as a wound, but as a testament. When Nia grew older, she often recounted it herself, not with shame, but with pride. "My mother," she would say, "was once struck because of who she was. But she never let that strike define her. Instead, she turned it into strength, not only for herself, but for all of us." And so the legacy of that moment endured. It became a beacon in their family's history, a reminder of the courage it takes to stand tall, and the power of dignity in the face of injustice. For Alana, the slap that once stung her skin no longer haunted her. It had transformed into something else entirely, a call to rise, a call to heal, and a call to keep walking forward with her head held high. The skies, once tainted with memory, now carried a different meaning. Every time she boarded a plane, holding her daughter's hand, she felt not fear but triumph, because she knew with unshakable certainty that no matter how high the altitude, their worth would never again be questioned. Years later, when Nia was in her teens, the story of that flight had already taken on a life larger than the family itself. What began as a single act of cruelty and the courage to confront, it had become part of a broader movement. Civil rights groups cited it as a modern reminder that discrimination does not vanish on its own. It must be challenged, exposed, and dismantled. Alana often found herself invited to speak at schools, churches, and women's organizations. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking had never been her dream. But each time she stood before a crowd, she remembered the frightened version of herself on that plane, clutching Nia as tears fell, and she thought of how many others still endured similar humiliations in silence. So she began to speak, not as a victim, but as a witness, a mother, and a woman who had turned her pain into a platform. Her talks were not angry, though her words carried fire. They were steady, reflective, and deeply human. "Dignity," she would often say, "is not something someone else can give you. It is yours from the day you are born. But sometimes the world will try to strip it away. And when that happens, you must hold on to it like your very breath." Audiences listened in pin-drop silence, often leaving in tears, inspired to carry her words into their own lives. Derek, meanwhile, continued to walk the difficult path of corporate change. His airline had become a model for others, but it also made him a target. Competitors accused him of politicizing business. Investors sometimes questioned why so much money was spent on training, outreach, and accountability systems. But Derek's answer never wavered. This isn't charity. This is survival. No company can thrive in the skies if it fails on the ground of humanity. The family's story eventually caught the attention of documentary filmmakers. When they approached Alana, she was reluctant. She worried about exposing Nia to scrutiny again. But Derek convinced her that the story no longer belonged only to them. It had become a symbol. The documentary, released worldwide, painted not just the incident but the journey that followed. The reforms, the speaking engagements, the letters from strangers who had found courage in their story. By then, Nia was old enough to watch it with her friends. At school, some whispered, some stared, but many offered her respect she had never known before. She came home one day, her eyes shining. "Mama, one of my classmates said your story gave her the courage to report. When she was bullied, she said if you could stand up, so could she." Alana's heart swelled. This was the ripple she had prayed for. Not fame, not recognition, but change in real lives. And somewhere far away, Victoria, the woman whose hand had once struck, watched the documentary alone. She saw the face of the mother she had humiliated, the child she had frightened, and the family she had underestimated. For the first time in years, she cried, not out of self-pity, but out of a deep regret that could never be erased. She knew she would forever be remembered as the antagonist of this story. But she also resolved that her future actions would tell a different tale. For Alana, though, the focus was never on revenge or reputation. Her purpose had shifted. She realized her life's work had become more than being a wife, a mother, or even a survivor. She had become a teacher of dignity through her actions, her resilience, and her willingness to turn personal pain into collective progress. And so, the slap that once threatened to break her became the moment that defined her, not as a mark of weakness, but as the spark of a legacy. By the time Nia reached adulthood, the story of her mother's resilience had long been etched into the consciousness of her family, her community, and even the wider world. But for Nia, it was more than history. It was the soil from which her own identity had grown. She had watched her parents navigate storms with grace and courage. She had seen how her father balanced power with humility, how her mother carried pain and turned it into strength. These lessons shaped her in ways no textbook could. She carried them into her studies, into her friendships, and into the way she looked at the world. At university, Nia quickly became a voice for students who felt unseen or unheard. She didn't seek leadership positions at first, but people naturally gravitated toward her. When classmates faced discrimination or when policies seemed unjust, it was Nia they turned to. Her words carried the weight of experience, though she hadn't lived the slap herself. She had lived its legacy every day through her mother's story. One evening, during a campus forum on equity, Nia stood and told the story in her own words. She spoke not only of the incident, but of the ripple it created, her mother's courage, her father's reforms, the healing that grew from pain. The audience was moved to silence, and when she finished, they rose to their feet in applause. For many, it was the first time they realized that history is not just something found in books. It is something carried in the lives of those around us. Alana and Derek, sitting quietly at the back of the hall that night, exchanged a glance filled with pride. Their daughter had not only inherited their strength, she had made it her own. Years later, Nia chose a path of advocacy. She worked with organizations that focused on equity in education and air travel, bringing a new generation of ideas to the table. Where her father had changed corporate policies, she sought to change cultural mindsets. Where her mother had spoken of dignity as something to be defended, Nia spoke of it as something to be celebrated. In her speeches, she often returned to the same line. My mother was once struck because someone saw her as less. But she chose to rise, and in her rising, she gave me wings. It became her signature phrase, quoted in articles, shared on social media, printed on posters. And every time she said it, she looked at Alana in the audience and smiled, as if to say your fight was not in vain. For Alana, hearing her daughter speak those words was like watching the circle complete itself. What had begun as humiliation had become triumph, passed from one generation to the next. She knew the world would still have its battles, still have its injustices, But she also knew that her daughter was ready. The slap that once burned her cheek had long faded, but its lesson lived on, not as a mark of pain, but as a reminder of resilience. And in Nia, that resilience had taken root, blossoming into a life dedicated to justice, compassion, and unshakable pride. As Alana watched her daughter step onto stages, lead movements, and inspire countless others, she whispered the same words she had once spoken when Nia was just a baby in her arms. You are worthy. You are loved. You will never be less than anyone. Only now, those words had become more than a mother's promise. They had become a generational truth. Decades later, Nia stood at the podium of an international summit. Delegates from across the world filled the hall, leaders, activists, educators, and ordinary citizens who had come to listen. Cameras broadcasted her words to millions of homes. She was no longer just Alana and Derek's daughter. She had become a global voice, carrying a message of dignity and justice that transcended borders. Her voice was steady, her presence commanding. My life began in the arms of a mother who was told, through a single slap, that she was less than. But my mother chose to rise, and because she rose, I learned to stand. Today, I stand not only for her, not only for myself, but for every child, every family, and every traveler who has ever been told they don't belong. Dignity is not negotiable, it is our birthright. The audience erupted in applause, but for Nia, the sound faded into the background. Her thoughts drifted to her parents. Derek had passed some years earlier, remembered as both a brilliant businessman and a leader who had changed the face of an industry. Alana, now older and frailer, sat in the front row, her eyes glistening with tears of pride. She had lived long enough to see her daughter soar on wings forged in resilience. When Nia finished her speech, she stepped off the stage and embraced her mother. Alana whispered into her ear, her voice trembling but strong. You've turned my pain into power. You've made sure it wasn't wasted. That night, as mother and daughter looked out from their hotel balcony at a city glowing with lights, they reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a single humiliating act on a flight to a global movement affirming dignity, the arc of their story was proof that injustice can be transformed into legacy when courage meets love. And in the quiet of that moment, Alana smiled, knowing that the slap which once felt like an end had, in truth, been the beginning. It had birthed a story that would live far beyond her, carried forward by her daughter, and perhaps by generations yet to come. For what began in pain had ended in triumph. What was meant to silence had instead given voice. And what was intended to diminish had instead lifted a family and the world into a higher vision of justice, pride, and unshakable dignity. The skies, once a place of humiliation, had become the very stage upon which their legacy was written. And as long as their story was told, no one would forget that a single act of cruelty had awakened a movement of strength. Alana closed her eyes that evening, holding her daughter's hand, and breathed deeply. She had lived through the fire, and now she rested in the light of all that had come after. Their story was no longer just theirs. It belonged to the world. And so it ended, not with sorrow but with victory, not with silence but with an echo that would never fade.